200 people heard Vanessa Croft call her cheap. Exactly one of them, standing near the head table with a champagne flute halfway to her lips, understood in that same instant precisely who Vanessa had just humiliated in front of an entire wedding, and it took every ounce of self-control she had not to drop the glass. I'll tell you now, this isn't a story about a villain getting some cartoonish comeuppance. It's messier and more human than that, and I think that's exactly why it stayed with me since I first heard it. Let's get into it. Daniel Ashford was 45, the founder of Ashford Coastal Development, a real estate firm responsible for a good third of the waterfront properties along 3 states of coastline. He was marrying Vanessa Croft, 32, in a ceremony that had taken 11 months to plan and cost more than most people's homes, at a cliffside estate in Newport that his own father had once used for the same purpose, marrying Daniel's mother there 48 years earlier. 200 guests, a 12-piece orchestra, a dress that had required 3 fittings in Milan. Grace Bennett was 24 and had absolutely no business, by any account visible to the 200 people in that reception hall, being anywhere near the head table when Vanessa turned around and found her standing there. Grace worked for Harlow Events, the planning firm the Ashford family had used for 3 generations of weddings, funerals, and milestone anniversaries. She'd been on the job 11 months, mostly handling logistics nobody glamorous ever thinks about. Vendor timelines, seating chart disasters, the specific chaos of getting 200 place cards correctly assigned to 200 egos that all believed they belonged closer to the front. She wore the same simple black dress and flats every planning assistant at Harlow wore to events, plain enough to be functionally invisible, which was in fact the entire point of the uniform. She had taken this particular assignment for a reason none of her coworkers knew, and it had nothing to do with career advancement. Here's where I need to back up for just a minute, because the rest of this doesn't make sense without it, and I promise I'll keep it short. Grace's mother, Eleanor Bennett, had worked as a housekeeper for the Ashford family for 6 years, starting when Daniel was 21 and finishing, abruptly, the year he turned 27. Eleanor had died 14 months before this wedding, of complications from a long illness she'd kept mostly private, and in the weeks after her funeral, Grace had gone through her mother's things and found a small locked box in the back of a closet, containing letters Eleanor had never sent and a single photograph of a much younger Daniel Ashford, standing beside her mother on a dock somewhere, both of them laughing at something the camera hadn't captured. The letters told Grace what her mother never had in 24 years of raising her alone, that Eleanor and Daniel had been in a relationship, quiet and serious on Eleanor's side, casual and consuming on his, in the 2 years before his family pressured him into an engagement with a different woman entirely, a merger disguised as a marriage that had ultimately ended in divorce 8 years later. Eleanor had been 3 months pregnant when Daniel's engagement was announced. She had never told him. She'd left the household within the month, taken a housekeeping position 2 states away, and built an entire life for her daughter around a single, careful lie, that Grace's father was a man who simply hadn't wanted to stay. Grace had spent 14 months since her mother's death not knowing what to do with any of it. She hadn't reached out, she hadn't confronted anyone. She had, in the end, done something smaller and stranger, something she still couldn't fully explain to herself even now. She'd applied for the Harlow Events position specifically because she recognized the Ashford name on a client list, and when the Newport wedding assignment came up 11 months later, she had quietly, deliberately requested it, telling herself she just wanted to see the estate, the man, the life her mother had walked away from without ever explaining why. She had not planned to be noticed. That part, at least, had gone exactly as intended, right up until the moment it very much did not. The reception was 2 hours in when the trouble started, and it started over something almost embarrassingly small, the way these things usually do. A centerpiece near table 6 had tipped during setup, and Grace had been sent to quietly fix it before the head table's photographs began, which put her, for roughly 90 seconds, standing directly beside the raised platform where the bride and groom were seated, adjusting a floral arrangement with her back half turned to the room. Vanessa, flushed from champagne and irritated about a photographer running behind schedule, turned to say something to her maid of honor and found, instead, an unfamiliar young woman in a plain black dress, standing close enough to the head table to be in the next round of photographs. "Excuse me," Vanessa said, her voice pitched to Carrie, whether she intended it to or not. "Who let the help stand this close to the platform? This is supposed to be photographed." Grace straightened, already reaching for her earpiece to explain, but Vanessa wasn't finished. She looked Grace over, top to bottom, in the particular way people do when they've decided someone is beneath the effort of basic courtesy, and something in her expression shifted from irritated to actively unkind. "God, look at this dress," Vanessa said, not quite to Grace, not quite to the room, but loud enough that both heard it clearly. "This is a black tie wedding. Did nobody tell the caterers they're allowed to at least try? It's genuinely cheap, honey. I can see the fabric pilling from here." A few people near the front laughed, the uncomfortable kind of laugh that happens when nobody's sure whether they're allowed to disagree with the bride. Grace felt her face go hot, the particular specific humiliation of being mocked for the exact thing, a simple, functional uniform that had nothing to do with her actual worth and everything to do with a job she was, in fact, doing quite well. She might have simply apologized and stepped away, the way she'd been trained to, the way anyone in her position would have. That's what should have happened next, and for about 2 seconds it looked like it would. Instead, Daniel's mother, Margaret Ashford, 71 years old, seated at the head table in the chair of honor reserved for the groom's remaining parent, went very still. "I want you to notice something here, because it's easy to miss on a first pass." Margaret wasn't looking at Grace's dress at all. She was looking at Grace's face, and she had been, in fact, for slightly longer than the 90 seconds the centerpiece had required, with an expression that had nothing to do with the current commotion, and everything to do with a memory she hadn't let herself sit with in a very long time. "Vanessa," Margaret said, her voice quiet but carrying the specific authority of a woman who had run this family's social calendar for 5 decades. "That's enough." "Margaret, I know exactly what you were doing," Margaret said, and then, more slowly, still looking at Grace. "What's your name, dear?" "Grace," Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Grace Bennett. I'm with Harlow Events. I apologize for the interruption. I was just fixing the centerpiece." Margaret Ashford did not respond to any of that. She stood up from the head table in front of 200 guests who had gone from uncomfortable laughter to complete, riveted silence within the space of about 4 seconds, and she walked around the table until she was standing directly in front of Grace, close enough to study her face properly. "Bennett," Margaret said quietly. "Your mother's name was Eleanor." It wasn't a question, and Grace felt the floor of the entire evening tilt slightly beneath her. "How do you know that?" Grace asked. Daniel, who had been half-turned toward the photographer trying to salvage the shot list, turned fully around now, his expression shifting from confused to something else entirely as he actually looked, for the first time that evening, at the young woman his fiancée had just publicly humiliated. "I'll be honest, I've heard a version of this next moment told a few different ways by people who were actually in that room, and they don't all agree on exactly what was said first. But everyone agrees on this much." Daniel went pale in a way that had nothing to do with the champagne, and Margaret's next sentence landed on that entire reception hall like something physical. "Because you have her exact eyes," Margaret said, "and her exact chin, and I have spent 24 years wondering whether I would ever have the chance to say that out loud to someone. You could have heard a fork drop in that room. Somewhere near the back, someone actually did, and the sound seemed enormous." "Mom," Daniel said carefully, "what are you talking about?" Margaret turned to her son, and whatever she'd been holding back for over 2 decades seemed to finally come loose all at once. "Eleanor Bennett," she said. "You're Eleanor." "The one you wouldn't stop talking about the summer before your father pushed you into marrying Catherine. I knew, Daniel. I knew she left pregnant. I never told you because your father made it very clear what would happen to this family's reputation if word ever got out, and I have regretted every single day of silence since." Grace stood very still, the centerpiece completely forgotten in her hands. 200 guests watching a conversation that had absolutely nothing to do with any of them, and everything to do with the 3 people now standing at the center of it. "You knew," Daniel said slowly, "and you never told me I had a daughter. Here's the part I think is worth sitting with for a second. Whatever side of this you find yourself on. Margaret wasn't a villain in this story, not really. She was a frightened young mother-in-law 24 years ago, protecting a family reputation the way she'd been raised to believe mattered more than almost anything else, and she had spent every year since watching that decision curdle into something she couldn't undo. What would you have done, in her position, all those years ago? I genuinely don't think there's a clean answer, and I don't think this story is asking you to find one. I have letters," Grace said quietly, finding her voice again. "My mother wrote them and never sent them. I found them after she passed, 14 months ago. That's actually why I took this assignment. I wanted to see this place. I wasn't going to say anything, I promise you. I never meant for any of this to happen tonight." Vanessa, still standing near the head table, had gone from flushed to completely white, the reality of what she'd just done settling over her in front of the largest audience of her entire life. "I didn't know," she said, mostly to Daniel. Her voice smaller than anyone in that room had heard it all evening. "I had no idea. I would never have." "I know," Daniel said, not unkindly, though his attention was entirely elsewhere. He was looking at Grace the way a person looks at something they're afraid might disappear if they blink. 24, he said quietly. You're 24. In March, Grace said. Eleanor left in the spring, Daniel said, doing the math out loud, his voice catching somewhere in the middle of the sentence. I looked for her. Did you know that? For almost a year, I tried to find out where she'd gone, and everyone told me she just didn't want to be found. And I believed them, because it was easier than believing anything else. The reception did not resume for close to 40 minutes. I know that sounds almost impossible for a wedding with 200 guests and a schedule tight enough to require a coordinator with an earpiece, but grief and shock have a way of stopping even the most carefully planned evenings cold. Daniel asked Grace, in front of everyone, whether she would sit with him, just for a while, and Grace, still holding a centerpiece that nobody had thought to take from her hands, said yes. The wedding itself did continue, eventually, later that night, in a smaller, quieter version of the celebration everyone had originally planned for. Vanessa and Daniel did marry, though anyone in that room could tell you the marriage that began that evening looked very little like the one that had been planned 11 months earlier. Vanessa spent the rest of the reception unusually subdued, and in the weeks that followed, she and Daniel worked through what turned out to be a serious, difficult recalibration of what they actually wanted from each other. A conversation Grace's arrival had accelerated but hadn't, by itself, caused. Whatever cracks the marriage survived, or didn't, in the months after, belonged entirely to the two of them, and Grace was careful, deliberately and repeatedly, to stay out of it, telling Daniel plainly, the first time they spoke privately, that she hadn't come looking for anything from him except, maybe, some answers. She got more than that, in time. Daniel established a relationship with his daughter slowly, without trying to compress 24 missing years into a single dramatic gesture, which Grace later told a close friend was the thing she respected most about how he handled it. He did not try to buy back the years with money, though he did, eventually, and with Grace's full input, set up a fund in Eleanor's name at the community college where she'd once hoped, before her illness made it impossible, to finish the accounting degree she'd started, and abandoned the year Grace was born. Margaret Ashford, for her part, spent the better part of a year in quiet, difficult conversation with her son about the decision she'd made and the decades of silence that followed it. It did not fully repair the relationship overnight, and I won't pretend it did. But Margaret was, by every account from people who know the family now, the first to show up when Grace needed anything at all, in the particular, overcorrecting way of someone trying to make up for lost time she knows she can never actually get back. As for the dress, the one Vanessa had called cheap in front of 200 people, Grace kept it. She still has it, in fact, hanging in the back of her closet, not because of what Vanessa said about it, but because of everything that happened in the 90 seconds after. If there's one thing worth taking from this story, it's this. The people we dismiss without a second look are so rarely as small as we've decided to make them in our minds. Sometimes the woman in the plain black dress standing too close to your photographs is exactly the person your entire family has spent 24 years hoping and dreading they might one day meet. Let me know in the comments. Did you suspect Grace's connection before Margaret said her mother's name? Or did that line hit you the same way it hit that whole room? I'm curious how many of you caught it early. If you're new here, subscribe, because we've got a story like this waiting every week. And if this one moved you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that it's never too late to say the thing you've been too afraid to say. I'll see you in the next one.